Good afternoon. I'm Jeffrey Herbst, president of American Jewish University in Los Angeles. Today, it's a pleasure to welcome back a friend of American Jewish University, Michael Oren. Michael, of course, a distinguished historian, wrote the definitive history of the Six-Day War, 6 Days of War, a distinguished diplomat, was Israel's ambassador to the United States, a member of the Knesset, and an author. And today we'll be talking about another one of his novels that will be published on May 11th, To All Who Call in Truth. Michael was kind enough to share an advanced copy with me. I was delighted to read it. We'll be talking about the novel, but of course, not introducing any spoilers so that you too can enjoy it. Michael, welcome. So glad that you're back on B'Yachad.
What a pleasure to be back, Jeffrey. B'Yachad, together. Thank you.
Michael, before we get to the novel, I know that so many in our audience who know you, who have followed you, are interested in your views on current developments. Can you tell us, will Israel finally have a government?
Yeah, I think in the next 10, 15 years, we'll probably have a government. I'm an optimist by nature. So 10, 15 years, pretty optimistic. We're stuck. We're stuck as long as Benjamin Netanyahu is the prime minister and competing for prime minister. We will be stuck. Think of the 2016 election in the United States. It wasn't right and left. It was establishment, anti-establishment. And here it's Bibi, anti-Bibi. And in the anti-Bibi camp, you have left wingers, you have right wingers, you have very right wingers and very left wingers, and you have Jews and Arabs together. So the question is, in that anti-Netanyahu camp, can they cobble together a coalition? As of tonight, they cannot. As of tonight, the coalition can only be sustained with the implicit or explicit support of the Arab list parties, particularly the Arab Islamic Party called Ram, and it was actually the illegal Israeli branch of Hamas. And Naftali Bennett is the key to all of this. Naftali Bennett heads a party called Yamina, meaning rightward. And he has to decide whether to join the anti-Bibi coalition and become prime minister, or to remain the head of Yamina. He can't do both. Why? Because if he becomes prime minister, then his base will disappear. They will vote for other right-wing parties. Israeli politicians are already thinking about the next election, Jeffrey. They're thinking, oh, if this government, even if I go into this government in the last 2 weeks, I'm going to go into elections having joined with the Arabs and the leftists, and I will lose my entire base. There it is in a nutshell, what's happening. Netanyahu is hoping now that the opposition will not be able to form a government. They have 21 days. And I've said on Israeli news, brace yourself, it's a little controversial. I've said that Bibi's a little like Hamas. Why? Because in a war, Hamas has only not to lose in order to win. And this is what it is with Bibi. He just doesn't have to lose the election. He doesn't have to win the election. If he doesn't lose, he wins. Because then we go for another 4 months, another 5 months. As we say in Hebrew, the king may die, the dog may die. Things can change. And he's just, he hopes to kick that can down the road and remain prime minister.
Michael, that was a wonderfully concise summary of the current situation. We could obviously talk for hours about it, but we want to get to the novel, but let me ask you one more question. We just marked Joe Biden's 100 days in office. You're a close follower, of course, of American politics and U.S. policy towards Israel. But what are your observations so far as terms of his stance towards Israel in the Middle East?
I think here you have to distinguish between his domestic policy and his foreign policy. The domestic policy, I think, is overwhelmingly successful. He's given out a lot of funds, printed out a lot of money, and I think people in the United States needed it. He's focusing on domestic issues. The United States needed it, and he's taken the whole tone down. I got to tell you, I read the New York Times in the morning and I fall back to sleep. It's just there's nothing really interesting going on, and which is good. I think the United States, needed that. It's the equivalent of having a club soda after a night in the town. You just got to sort of take it easy. On the foreign policy, though, particularly in the Middle East, the big issue for us is the Iran nuclear deal. The administration shows every indication of wanting to renew the 2015 JCPOA at just about any cost. The Iranians keep escalating. The United States keeps de-escalating. And the administration's position is that should the JCPOA be renewed, then the administration will seek a longer and stronger deal. But Israelis are at loss to determine or see in any way how that deal would be achieved, because in order to get the JCPOA to be renewed, to get it back to what was in 2015, the United States will have to give up all of its leverage. We'll have to give up all the sanctions. And the Iranians are not going to do anything unless they're pushed into it. They're not going to give up their ballistic missile program. They're not going to give up their support for Hezbollah and for Hamas unless they're pressured to do that. The United States is giving up its leverage. We view, and I say we collectively, we view the 2015 Iranian nuclear deal as a strategic threat, a potentially existential threat. We do not believe that it blocks the path to a bomb. We believe it pays Iran's path to the bomb, does nothing to interdict Iran's attempt to build a nuclear warhead, and actually accelerates Iran's intercontinental ballistic system. It's an extraordinary document in that way. We're going to talk about my novel, but if you have to read something that I've written recently, go to my article in the Atlantic Monthly, written with my good friend Yossi Klein-Levy. We wrote about Israel's position on JCPOA. We spent a lot of time on it, and it's an immensely complex issue. It's technologically complicated. I think that this article unpacks it in a way that's accessible to anybody.
Michael, we were privileged to talk about your collection of short stories in the fall. Now we're talking about your novel. Why did you decide to write another novel now?
That's what I used to ask myself every morning. There it is, to all call in truth. I don't go to these things, Jeff. They come to me. I don't have a choice. But my relationship with literature is not democratic, and it is dictatorial. And as is with short stories, the short stories will appear to me and say, okay, you're going to write me whether you like it or not. And I'll say, oh, it's too complicated. It's too esoteric. And they'll say, no, you're going to do it. You're going to do your best. And sometimes it doesn't succeed. This is a novel, I think, that has been in my soul for many, many years. It brings me back to the world in which I grew up. It takes place in a small East Coast suburban town in the beginning of the 1970s. And it's about a Jewish community. Much of the book takes place around a conservative synagogue and with a Jewish youth movement. And it has cameo appearances by Elie Wiesel, by Shlomo Kalibach, and by Meir Kahane. There's even a small scene with Yitzhak Rabin in it, because these were the figures of our world. We had these towering Jewish figures, towering in the good way and the bad way. In the case of Meir Kahane, the bad way. That were hugely influential. I think that was the last period in American Jewish history when Jews still considered themselves an ethnic group. And I'm unconvinced that whether Jews today in the United States consider themselves an ethnic group. It's an open question, but it wasn't back in the 1970s. The great writers I grew up on, the Philip Roths and Bernard Malamud and Saul Bellow, they all asked that one question: how can I be Jewish and American at the same time? Saul Bellow opens up Augie March, the Adventures of Augie March, with that classic line. He says, I am an American Chicago born. Trust me, Jeffrey, John Updike didn't have to write in his book, I am an American Pennsylvania born, right? He doesn't have to say that. But Saul Bellow felt the need to affirm it. I think that question, how I can be American and Jewish at the same time, is not only not asked by young American Jews today, it's not even understood by young American Jews today. Even ultra-Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn don't understand that question. You say, what are you talking about? I'm American as everybody, But that was a question that we had to ask, because America back then was still a white bread country. And, to be a president, you had to be white. To be an astronaut, you had to be white. It was, and Jews were not quite right. We were not quite white. We're an ethnic group, and that world has largely disappeared. And I wanted to recapture that world.
And in fact, one of the characters early on, while looking around a deli, says, "This world will disappear."
And what does his friend say? His friend says, "Yeah, they all do. They all do." And I don't know if you grew up around one of those delis, but they were amazing. Brunch Vatsniks.
Michael, the title is from Psalm 145. It also appears on the wall of the fictitious Bethel synagogue in the book. The Lord is near to all who call on him, to all who call on truth. why this line? That's the title.
Well, two reasons. One, because that quote was actually on the wall of my synagogue that I grew up in, and with those golden wooden letters. But I think the book is about truth, and it's about the search for the truth that you can actually share with God. Now, the Judaism of this 1972 conservative Jewish community is sort of spiritually vapid, and it's thrashing around. It has many causes. It has Soviet Jewry. It has Israel. There's a junior rabbi in this story who has posters of Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir in his room. I mean, that was the day when when Moshe Dayan and Abba Eban were the icons of American Jewry. But right next to that, you could have a Mao poster. You could have a Che poster, right? And a lot of anti-war posters. That was that moment in American Jewish history. But nobody seems to have spiritual answers. And I think the only person who is truly spiritual in this story is the janitor. And he's very much based on the custodian in my synagogue, who for me was a great source of spiritual inspiration. Gary, if you're out there somewhere, I'll never forget you. He also taught me how to play chess.
Okay, which appears
Right?
also, right.
He taught me how to play chess. It's in there too.
And also provides leftovers to the main character from lots of festive meals. So I don't know if
Yes, he raids the refrigerators. Pieces of bar mitzvah cake. So that's why the title is about the search for truth. And I think that my protagonist is grappling with that, not necessarily successfully. He doesn't know who he is. And I think by not knowing who he is, he has a hard time communicating with God.
Michael, the main character, I'm not giving much away here, was a star athlete in high school, suffers a debilitating injury that leads to a lot of disappointments. Now, is that were you also a star football player, or?
No, I was the fat kid who gets the crap beat out of him. I was the other guy. Okay, it derives from a wonderful. I grew up in a Sicilian neighborhood, and one of my neighbors was Vito Sicente. I'm not making that up. And he was a star running back, and he was handsome, and the cheerleader loved him. Cheerleader I had a crush on, Angela, of course. And he was bound for Annapolis. They were recruiting him for Annapolis. And on Thanksgiving Day, he was clipped from behind and broke his leg. And today, I think he runs a dry cleaner. And it's so the book is also about disappointment and how you grapple with disappointment in life, and how that one moment in Sandy Cooper's life sets him off on a completely different trajectory. And he's a complicated figure, but he is kind of heroic, because even though he's been dealt a very raw deal by having his dream of being at Annapolis and being a professional football player snatched away from him at 17, he becomes a dedicated teacher and has a deep sense of duty. So along with his disappointment, there's an element of heroism about this man.
Michael, most every character in the book, except for the janitor, seems disappointed and unhappy. Was that a choice? Was that a reflection? And everyone, I was trying to tote up the characters at the end of the book. Almost everyone is worse off, it seems.
No, I disagree. I think that his best friend, Saperstein, is a very positive figure. He's kind of indomitable. He's a cop. Sandy's best friend is a cop named Saperstein, and who we call Saps. He's indomitable. His wife is indomitable. Marjorie is not defeated. The caretaker from his father in the old age home is not defeated, and the junior rabbi, right, Stanley, is not defeated. He's upbeat. He's like annoyingly upbeat. There are people who are very upbeat. Some of the teachers and the staff, I think, are become like Jeannie, comes out very much ahead. She discovers who she is. She discovers her sexual orientation. And it's a process of self-discovery. So it's true that Sandy and his wife, some of these characters come out, get that raw end. But even at the end of the book, and I hear no spoiler, I think the end of the book leaves you with a sense that Sandy in his own way cannot be defeated. There's an element in him which is sort of irreducibly indomitable, and he has my sympathy, but he also has my respect. This man.
The main characters are Jewish, But how much is this a Jewish novel?
I think it's a very Jewish novel. I think it's inherently Jewish novel. I think the last time I spoke to you, I talked about writing as a Jewish activity. That our tradition, and we don't know what our ancient Jewish music sounded like. We don't know what our ancient Jewish architecture looked like, but we've got literature, and we have short stories. Right? We talked about the Book of Jonah, but we also have novels. Now, the Book of Exodus is a fabulous novel. It's a classic Odyssey novel. The hero going from place to place to place, trying to get home, and encountering all sorts of difficulties. It's a great novel. So we Jews, we know how to tell a story, and I think just the challenges that Sandy Cooper and others face in this world make it very Jewish. There's another reason, and when I began to write this novel, I feared that my readers would look at the level of anti-Semitism described in the book and wouldn't believe it. Now, I grew up in this Catholic neighborhood, and I had the stuffing beat out of me all the time. And I was a Christ killer, and I encountered much anti-Semitism actually throughout my entire life, in sports later too, especially in the sports world. And but I later met Jews who had never encountered anti-Semitism. I was shocked. What do you mean, really? No one's ever said anything to you like that? No. So I was afraid that people wouldn't be able to identify it, and it would sort of lack verisimilitude. In the last few years, I don't think anybody's questioning, alas, quite unfortunately, tragically, no one's questioning the incidence of anti-Semitism, the prevalence of anti-Semitism in the United States. And generally speaking, I think the book of 1972 foreshadows an America of 2021. And, I think I'm older than just about anybody, but the world of 1971, 1972 in the United States was a very uncertain and unstable world. There were, the Weatherman Underground was putting bombs in federal offices, and the Kent State and demonstrations in the streets of Chicago. And if you asked a lot of young people back then at the time, you'd say, well, this country really doesn't have much of a future. So I think that readers of the book will look at the world that I've recreated here and say, this looks kind of familiar in an eerie way.
Michael, let's continue with that last idea which you developed. How would you compare the anti-Semitism that you encountered in the early 1970s that is portrayed in the book with what the ADL is reporting today in its most recent report on the state of hate that came out last week? How is it similar? How is it different?
I think back then you had mostly right-wing anti-Semitism. Today, I think you have much more left-wing anti-Semitism. I sit on a board of the Jewish Agency with Natan Sharansky, and we monitor the situation on American campuses. And I got to tell you, it's quite frightening. And this is overwhelmingly left-wing anti-Semitism, where Jewish kids, proactive Israel activists on American campuses are being physically threatened. They get death threats. We've had cases of very fine students literally being driven off campus. So this didn't happen back then. Matter of fact, our campuses, when I went to school, I had Palestinian friends and Syrian friends. The academic life itself was not highly politicized. That really came about in the 80s and the 90s. What has really changed, I mean, substantively changed, is the degree to which anti-Semitism has become almost acceptable in the United States in a way that it wouldn't be. Today, the assumption that because Jews are white today, but not just white, they are sort of supremely white. They are privileged and influential and affluent. That means that prejudice against Jews is not on the level of other forms of racism against people who are not affluent and don't have that kind of power. That distinction is a deadly distinction. I fight against it with all my might. And I encounter it a lot, people making it. I encounter Jews who make that distinction. And that did not exist back then. Anti-Semitism was considered racism, period, on a par with racism against people of color, certainly. And today that distinction is made. And I think that it's to say it's a slippery slope is doing an injustice to the slope. It's more like a cliff.
How do you explain, given a society that devotes seemingly endless resources to diversity, inclusion, equity, training, education, and the like, public statements now by leaders, but how do you explain that and yet the rise of the particular anti-Semitism that you're talking about?
Well, I think it has to do with a sort of a Manichaean / Marxist idea that divides the world between the oppressed and the oppressors. And in that bifurcation, we're coming down the wrong side. That is a dangerous situation for us. I think American Jews stand to be the great losers in the flattening out of American meritocracy. My parents' generations, they were first generations Americans. Their parents were carpenters and mechanics, my grandparents. My father's generation were all lawyers and doctors and went to all the fine schools in one generation because America offered you that opportunity. So Jews were the big beneficiaries of American meritocracy in spite of anti-Semitism. It was extraordinary. Today, where success, the criteria for success may not be, say talent, but one's skin color. That's going to impact the future fortunes of American Jewry.
Like when you talk about the synagogue life in the early 1970s, as portrayed in the book, are you more optimistic about synagogue life today?
I am indeed.
The kind of communities that you talk about and that you work with and that you know so well?
I get up in front of the Knesset and I scream in Hebrew, and I go on Israeli television and I scream in Hebrew, all right? And I write for the Israeli press and I scribble in Hebrew. I read my bar mitzvah in transliteration. I did 5 years of Hebrew school. Did not teach me like to read my own parsha, my bar mitzvah. And it was vapid. It was boring. My Hebrew school teacher was called Rabbi Gurkov. Try being 11 years old and concentrating on your Hebrew teacher when his name is Rabbi Gurkov. It was horrible. I think there was a study done some years ago that said one of the big factors for intermarriage is 5 years of a conservative Hebrew school. And today, when I travel around American synagogues, liberal synagogues, conservative reform, reconstructionists, I'm amazed at the level of Hebrew learning of young people. But in many bar mitzvahs, the level of Hebrew education is just extraordinary. And I think that also synagogues have been infused with a spirituality that was totally lacking in my upbringing. There was zero spirituality. It was desiccated, Judaism. And now I think you go to these synagogues, these communities, and there is life there. There is light there, and I've seen it. And I think I only wish more Israelis could see it and get a sense of the vitality of American Jewish life.
Michael, you mentioned some of the authors that have influenced you. Roth, of course, who weighs heavily, I think, on the book. Bellow. To me, there was some Coetzee, especially in his book Disgrace.
You got it. Bingo. Yeah.
Maybe you could talk about how you relate to these authors, great, except for Coetzee, great authors of previous American generation, how you think about them, how you use them, how you're in conversation with them.
It's literally a conversation. And so I'm going back to these authors who so deeply influenced me and saying, listen, I'm gonna tackle some of the same issues. Certainly relationship between men and women, family relationships, how you grapple with disappointment in life, but also I am not going to shy away from the Jewish content. And for me, Judaism is not a joke, because you're reading Portnoy's Complaint, you read Sabbath's Theater. Judaism is a Jewish joke, and I want to approach the actual spiritual aspect of Jewish identity in America, and the difficulties with it. I want to delve more deeply, and I hopefully more authentically, into my female characters. Philip Roth has particularly been, taken to task for the way he treats female characters, and I hope that my female characters attain a complexity, and indeed a heroism in the case of Sandy's wife. I hope that's the goal, but it's a conscious dialogue. It truly is. Other authors that influenced me. I'm a huge Ambrose Bierce fan. Those of you who haven't read Ambrose Bierce, read him. Fabulous. I'm now reading again. Many times I'll go back and read Sherwood Anderson. I'm reading right now tonight. I'm reading Weinberg, Ohio. What a storyteller! What a fabulous storyteller. You can never stop reading the greats. You go back to them again and again.
Michael, do you know how the book ends when you start it?
Broadly, yes. It's a bit of a whodunit, but the he who did it got changed toward the end of the book. But broadly speaking, when I see a short story and when I see a novel in my head, I envision a suspension bridge. I don't know if this is going to speak so much to the people on the West Coast, but think of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. Remember that one? And I can see the beginning of the bridge on one bank. I can see the end of the bridge on the other bank, but I don't know how the two sides are going to meet in the middle. And that is the challenge. I don't know how they meet in the middle. I just finished another novel, and actually not a Jewish novel. And it's a novel set on an island that I made up, an imaginary island off the coast of Massachusetts in the year 1944, when most of the fishermen and people on the island are off fighting World War II. And the island is home to 90 Italian prisoners of war. And it's also home to a policewoman whose husband's off in the Marines, and she's now taken over the police force of this island. And she's got a problem because one after another, these Italian prisoners are being murdered. And she alone, in the face of great opposition, has to find the murderer of the Italian. Okay, that's the broad that is the very generally the plot of this book called Fourth Cliff. I started off, I sort of knew how it ended. I knew how it ended, but I didn't know who did it. It's a whodunit where I didn't know who did it. And it has the culprit, the perpetrator, revealed himself to me over the course of writing. And that's a very common thing. I think it's not just for me, I think for many writers. Your characters reveal themselves. And I think last time I was on the podcast, I talked about working in Hollywood, working for Orson Welles. But I also worked for a wonderful scriptwriter named Paula Miller, who taught me lessons about writing that I never forgot. One of the lessons that she taught me was, you as a writer are the creator with a capital C. When you create a character, you have a tremendous responsibility to make that character as full and believable as possible. No one just walks across your page. There's no bit parts in your novel. And I have adhered to that rule ever since. And some of these characters reveal themselves in surprising ways. Oh, that's who you are. You're not just there picking out strawberries on a shelf. You're actually there to have an immense impact on the novel.
What advice would you give to first-time authors, people just starting out?
Put on your armor. Put on your armor. And because I used to collect all my rejections, and over the years they made up a file that was about as thick as the New York phone book, if you remember what that looked like. And everyone hurt as much as the first one. But if in your soul you are a writer, then press on. I had some of my best friends, Jeff, believe me, told me to stop writing because they couldn't stand to see my suffering. And I would say to them, if I were a musician and I never made the Philharmonic and all I did was play bar mitzvahs, that wouldn't make me any less of a musician, right? Because this is who I am. And so I, pressed on until I got fewer rejections. I still get rejections. And that's part of it. And look into yourself, know who you are, and press on.
In the time frame of your book, American Jews were uniformly or overwhelmingly pro-Israel, still in the afterglow of the Six-Day War. Today, Israel is a more contentious issue among American Jewry. And how does that play into your understanding of anti-Semitism and of where American Judaism is headed.
Yeah, it's true. Back in the 70s, if you remember, the logo of UJA was "We Are One." Remember that one? I don't think we'd say that today. We are one. We are actually many. And there's not one American Jewish community. There are many American Jewish communities, and you can't generalize. Certainly, anti-Semitism / anti-Israel feeling and sentiments play a role. They exacerbate the divisiveness of Israel. Israel has become a divisive factor. I was aware of it even as an ambassador some years ago. But the huge debate over the definition of anti-Semitism, whether anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism, is an immensely divisive issue among Jewish scholars. There's recently a petition signed by, I think, 300 liberal Jewish scholars saying that anti-Israel sentiment is not anti-Semitic. I would take issue with that. But we can't even agree, particularly in the United States, we can't even agree on a definition of anti-Semitism. I had a very simple definition when I was growing up. It was Vito punching me in the nose. That not to put too a fine point on it. That's what it was. But today we debate over that. And it's very difficult to fight against a scourge that you can't define.
Michael, do you think in the United States, we'll leave it to the U.S., that Zionism has become a phrase and an idea to be avoided? Has it accumulated too much baggage, especially among the younger generation?
My short answer is no. I've actually attended several seminars where the question was raised: should we abandon the word Zionism? For precisely the reason you mentioned. It's too loaded. It's too tainted. And the answer is no. I think that by abandoning Zionism, we will incur more disrespect and wrath. Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. It aspires to create a national homeland for the Jewish people in our ancestral homeland. Zionism, if you want to put it in truly liberal terms, is affirmative action for the Jewish people. It's rectifying 2,000 years of a wrong that cost us more grievously than anybody can possibly imagine. So I think we will gain more respect by standing firm as Zionists than giving into it and throwing it away.
You think that's where the American Jewish establishment is, or do you sense some wavering on that?
No, I don't sense a lot of wavering. I don't. I think that there's a tendency now, there's sort of a, as you will, sort of a reconquista and the counter-reformation, if you will. And that is that there's a rallying around Zionism, much more so now, because the term itself has been so embattled.
Michael, you made Aliyah in the 70s. You were a lone soldier before that term, I think, was invented. How does making Aliyah today compare to what you experienced?
I went through an Aliyah process with a friend, and I got to tell you, I burst out crying. Why? Because Nefesh V'Nefesh has an 8-step program, okay, that you complete in about an hour and a half. That 8-step program in an hour and a half took me over 2 years to do back in the 1970s, and endless waiting in various offices with people with stamps and, just horrible. It today, certainly coming from North America, Aliyah could not be easier. Could not be easier. Listen, you're coming to a foreign country. Even Israel today is not the Wild West it was in the 1970s. It was a Wild West. A phone call to the United States, a 5-minute phone call, cost well over $100 back then. And took an entire day to dial the international operator over and over again with these little, the tokens you put in. It was the Wild West. It's not that way. At the end of the day, it's still a foreign country. You're still in the Middle East. You're still in this, this melting, this cauldron. I wouldn't call it a melting pot. It's a cauldron, and it will be, for certain people, it will be a challenge. It'll be a challenge professionally too. But you just cannot compare. Even the lone soldiers. I established the lone soldiers caucus in Knesset, where we looked at what is being done for lone soldiers. Turns out that there's close to 50 different organizations catering to lone soldiers. All right. I didn't have socks or underwear. Okay. These guys have got designer socks and designer underwear. And it's amazing what they have. They want for nothing. I wanted everything. And it's terrific. It's great. I hope they're not spoiling these kids, but it is very, very different. On the other hand, Israel back then was not socially stratified. It was overwhelmingly lower middle class. We don't have the social gaps that we have today between rich and poor, the high-tech sectors, the non-high-tech sectors. We were not as politically divided as we are today. And Zionism back in the 70s was cool. It's that rabbi in the synagogue in To All Who Calls in Truth who has the picture of Che and next to the posters of Diane and Golda Meir. You are not going to see that today.
Michael, always a pleasure to talk with you.
My
about
pleasure.
politics, novels, everything else.
Hard to say goodbye.
Very much.
Hard to say goodbye. Good night. Lila Tov from Jaffa.